We have witnessed the future, and it tastes blue. I don't know about you, but the little Sims and workers and resources really like clean water. I know! So what if there are a few flakes of sewage sludge and the odd bacterium here and there? But those people are fussier than cats and will have none of that. So I guess it's up to us to conjure up a special potion that turns random underground swill into crystal clear aqua. Last time in the Soviet Republic of Arab map, we found a pit full of red rocks, and as we usually do, we spent years to build a sprawling industrial combine, straddled the mountains, and founded a new city just to make metal logs a reality. However, the latest planning committee reports say that this work has shot our consumption of vital chemicals through the roof. And let's just say that consumption wasn't exactly low to begin with. Thankfully, Professor Scheissenberg from the Ouch Acidus Hot Department of the Order of the Red Banner Institute of Unpremeditated Explosions tells us that we can synthesize our own stuff, with 2 possible facilities for just that purpose that we can build. There's the small factory, and then there is the big one. I have said big, haven't I? How about colossal and ginormous, vast and massive, or just stupendously huge? If you think those aluminium factories were big, you don't know what big means. The big chemical plant is the largest structure you can build on workers and resources, so rev up your bulldozers, everyone, because fitting it in is gonna take some work. Needless to say, it's also wildly expensive and will take colossal effort and expense to make happen, outweighing the measly, pathetic aluminium plant in how much building even one would have to be an incredible project. But, and this is a very nice but, I'm sure we all see in our better dreams, it's jolly damn well profitable. Even if you import everything but labor, the rate of return is 83%. In 1985 prices, it's 24 grand a day and almost 9 mil a year. That's assuming you sell it all. However, we all know how popular blue chemicals are in our republic, so none of the product is likely to ever cross the border, yielding 85% for every bit that you don't have to import. But back to the factories themselves, and specifically to the small one, which, if you don't know, back in the day was the only official option for manufacturing chemicals. So how does it compare to the big one? It's physically smaller, obviously, and cheap enough to build early. And it pays off a bit sooner at full capacity, so at least on the surface, you get more for that initial investment. The small plant also both produces and consumes 11.6 times less stuff than the big one, which means that it rather boringly has virtually the same profitability and relative shares of different inputs. Meanwhile, the big plant comes with special benefits of its own. One is, interestingly, pollution. The factory does max out the pollution bar, but it's only 4.3% more than that of the small plant, although it makes almost 12 times more chems. The internal electricity consumption is also lower at 7.9 times of the small one. However, the most important strengths of the big plant are about space, infrastructure, and the real cost of construction, as opposed to the raw cost of building the factories themselves. The reality is that the small factories is only good if you're operating on the level of 2, maybe 3 of these. That is, if you consume about 2 tons of chemicals a day and you want to replace imports. For anything larger than that, there's simply no point but to invest in the big factory. Sure, you can use forklifts and arrange a bunch of small plants in a cool fabrication battery, but once you put all of the necessary connections in place, 6 small plants will take as much space as a single big one, which, let's not forget, replaces almost 12. 6 small plants also means 6 sewer, 6 water, 6 road connections with a spider web of pipelines and wires, and can easily require you to build more public transport stops and sewer, water, and power substations to cover this extensive complex, especially if you double the amount and go for the full 12. With a big plant, on the other hand, you just have one hole for each utility, which makes everything a lot simpler and faster to build without countless small construction items that tend to slow everything down. There's also the matter of the real cost of construction. This heavily depends on your conditions, of course, but a rough estimate shows the battery of 6 small plants needs about 150 to 200,000 rubles of additional expenses to cover all of the road and utility connections they need. Double it up to 12 and you get something that costs a third more than the big plant. The big one does need its own external infrastructure and utility lines too, of course, but to a much lesser extent. Notably, a big chunk of the additional costs comes from sewer connections, where the big plant only needs 1, as opposed to 12, and the smallest diameter pipe is still enough for its needs. Although, with a big plant, you might want to splurge a bit and invest in some railways, because at 14 worker capacity, a good train might be best to push that giant crowd into the factory. But why 1400 if it's 700, I hear you ask? The big plant sure is as perfect as an egg, sucking in a pile of cheap stuff and churning out a buttload of pure magic without much headache. But just like an egg, you can always enjoy two. The right arrangement for a pair of big plants suggests itself, with a warehouse for crops and chemicals and an open storage for timber placed between them. You can even plant a forest at the same site with woodcutting posts directly supplying the wood into the open storage. Another lovely thing about chemicals is that even with these two humongous factories, the total daily production is just 19 tons, which you can very easily truck out, either as exports or to a more centrally located warehouse which has its own distribution center that then spreads the chemicals around to all of the consumers. And speaking of consumers, there's another good reason to immediately aim for 2 big chemical plants instead of 1. 9.4 tons of chemicals a single plant produces a day might seem like a lot, but for any serious industrial expansion, it simply isn't. Before I set up the aluminium complex we talked about last time, the Soviet Republic of Arab Map was already gobbling up more than 10 tons a day, so if I decided to build any additional factories and had 1 chemicals plant at that point, I'd have to start importing once again. As a specific example, a full aluminium complex with 2 aluminium plants eats up 6.6 tons of chemicals every day. You pretty much need to build a big chems factory just to feed that. Now, how about our good old plastics and electronics combine then? 9.8 tons. Nuclear fuel, about 1.7 tons. We might also revisit clothing and specifically fabric factories in the future, and those are half a ton a day. Big water treatment plants eat half a ton as well, and with the need for good water everywhere, from electric kettles to cow troughs, it keeps pressing your chemicals demand upwards constantly, no matter what you decide to build. So planning and building to make a lot more than what you are currently consuming is a great idea here, especially since chemicals being compact and profitable as they are, they're a godsend for exports. So if there is any excess, you can just bring a couple of Kamazes and unload any excess on your neighbors. Oh, and there's another thing you can do with a surplus of chemicals. Something I happen to have pooped on in the past, and it's explosives. Having domestic production of chemicals actually makes them kind of interesting to manufacture and sell. With imported chems, the bomb factory earns a very drab 38% in profits, but making your own chemicals collapses the costs, and the profits skyrocket to 81%. I still don't really find explosives that attractive since you rarely need them and you inevitably export most of them, but then again, more exports is good, and since this type of factory needs gravel and wood just like the chems plant, you can plop a little explosives compound right next to your chemical duo and make almost 4 grand a day for every factory you run, at 1.1 tons of bang for your buck. So there, chemicals might be annoying and occasionally mustard gassy, but they're also astonishing and always magical, and the massive pollution excreting giants are just what you need to grow even further.